Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Abby said, I'm Julia Payne. I'm director of the Hub. And along with Andy here, I'm going to be taking you through today's session. The Hub, some of you will already know, we're a social enterprise working in the arts, across the arts. And we've been running these balance sessions now since June. There's a series of the monthly series of talks, and all of the talks that we've done are available on our YouTube channel. So I know there are quite a few people that maybe haven't been before. So if you do want to check out the previous ones that we've done, they are all available there, covering all sorts of topics: uncertainty, how to deal with change, how to stay motivated, those sorts of things. And we also have blogs from all of the sessions. We do our best in all of these sessions to get as much inspiration from each other as we do from Andy and myself. And there's a series of blogs that you'll find on our website that share all of the interactions from everyone who's been to all of those talks. I'd just like to introduce Andy, my co-host for today. Andy, would you just like to say a little bit about Mindapples, just for those who don't know?
Sure, yeah, nice to be back. Welcome back to familiar faces. And if you're new to this, then nice to see you all. It's nice to see so many people on the call, though. Don't know if that means lots of people are feeling burnt out. So I'm never quite sure if this is a positive, but very good to be with you all. Yeah, so what we do at Mindapples, we help encourage and support people to take better care of their minds. So we're interested in public mental health and well-being, and trying to particularly equip all of us with skills, knowledge to be able to manage our own minds, to do what we can to protect our health, but also to be productive, to be more creative, all kinds of different things. So some of our work is public health and charitable projects. We're working in schools, universities, healthcare trusts, and then quite a lot is in companies. So doing a lot of work with our clients at the moment to support them through the lockdown and the strange changes, which of course is affecting so many different industries differently. So it's a real mixed bag of all the different things people need, but quite an interesting, I guess, overview that gives us, all the different things that are going on. So happy to share what I can. Can't solve everything, but we'll give it a go.
Great, thanks, Andy. And I think along with Andy, I should have said it before, that the Hub, we have a particular interest and focus on people that are working as freelancers or in the slightly more sort of independent sectors of the arts. That's sort of our background, and it's certainly been the sort of focus of our work that we've done during lockdown. When we were talking about this session and about what we should focus on a couple of months ago, I guess, we were thinking that actually focusing on burnout would be a really good thing to do, because I think that even before all of this, in the kind of before times, that's the way I tend to think about it now, in a very sort of Margaret Atwood kind of way, there were lots of things that meant that incidences of burnout were on the rise in the creative sector. So, lack of that ongoing lack of work-life balance, increasing sort of financial security, the need to do more with less, and not least the kind of pressure that we put on ourselves. All of that meant that instances of burnout were much more common in the creative sector than they were maybe across the adult population at large. And then if you fast forward to now, to kind of life in the time of coronavirus, there are a whole swathe of new pressures and frustrations that mean that more of us than ever are susceptible to burnout. Even things like fear of going to the shops and things like when you think about the level of insecurity and the confusion that we're living under, it's not surprising that that's the case. And I think what I've been really struck by over the last few months is that our individual experiences are really different. Some people are working harder than ever, and some people can't work or can't do what they would normally do for work. But the thing that we all have in common amongst all of that is that we're all struggling to adapt to this kind of new reality that we find ourselves in. And certainly everyone that I know is kind of experiencing highs and lows, emotional highs and lows, on a kind of daily, if not hourly basis. And all of that is obviously, showing up wear and tear on our sort of longer term mood. So it felt really timely to ask, how can we turn down the heat perhaps on our emotions and start to sort of master our moods and keep burnout at bay. So that's what we're going to try and tackle today. We were saying earlier, not sure that we've got all the answers, but we can certainly throw some provocations into the mix. And I wanted to kick us off, first of all, by asking you, Andy, something about moods. So I mentioned 2020, obviously, massive roller coaster for all of us. But I know that you're keen for us to focus more on the kind of long-term impact that all of this is having on our mood. So I just thought it might be useful to kind of kick off with you talking a little bit about the difference between emotions and moods, and why you think that managing mood is really important right now.
Yeah, and it's sort of it felt like a good place to start, because it's one of the key concepts in a lot of our training and books and so on, is this distinction, but it's not necessarily one that we make in everyday conversation. We tend to talk about moods and emotions in a sort of quite interchangeable way, and people generally struggle to come up with definitions for what is a mood exactly. In fact, the more you say the word mood, the more it just seems like a really weird word, and you start wondering if it means anything. It's just made up, or some kind of character from Magic Roundabout or something. And so the key distinction with it is it's not a precise one, in that, you know, there's a lot of interaction between moods and emotions, but the way to think of it is that emotions are much more reactive to environment. So your emotional reactions tell you about how you're feeling about the things that are happening, the events and experiences in your life, and so they give you information about what you want more of, what you want less of, the things that you want to avoid, go towards. But moods are much more about your inner state, long-term kind of core background emotions, and often talked about as like an emotional body temperature. And we actually use the word in quite a similar way. So you all have some kind of temperature that your body is at the moment. But if you say, I've got a temperature, it means there's something extreme or wrong with your temperature. And it's the same with moods. You always have some kind of mood that you're in. But if you say, I'm in a mood, it means there's something extreme or wrong with your mood. And the reason it's helpful to have that distinction is that we can't often do everything about the day-to-day emotional experiences that you have. You get some bad news and you will react to it. It's not about trying to suppress that. So you can kind of end up chasing every single emotion, trying to think, how do I manage that? How do I manage that? And they're too fast. But mood management gives you a way to notice what you're taking on from that, how things are affecting you internally, what that shifts in how you come to the next experience. And a lot of the goal of mood management is to be able to deal with the previous things that have happened, so that they don't color your experience of the next thing. You can show up to the next experience feeling able to appreciate it for what it is, rather than still rerunning old battles or feeling affected by what happened yesterday. So that tends to be where we focus a bit more than on trying to change people's emotions, because actually it's quite healthy to feel lots of emotions. What you don't want is to get stuck only feeling one way for weeks or months or years. So that's the problem.
And so I suppose one of the things that we should all be thinking about in not just in terms of, you know, kind of keeping burnout at bay, but more generally, is just trying to figure out what helps us sort of manage our moods.
Yeah, we talk about, there's a model of mood management by Robert Thayer, who wrote a book called The Origins of Everyday Moods, and it's not a comprehensive model, but it's quite a useful model for most of our common moods. And it's essentially just energy and tension. It's how much energy you're feeling and how tense are you feeling. And if you understand where you're at in relation to those two, you've got a fairly good sense of where your mood is at. So some days you may find you've got lots of energy, but you're feeling very tense. So it's uncomfortable, but you're getting stuff done. Other times you might feel that you're very tired, but you're resources to be able to respond to all of that. And so that's why it's helpful, I think, to frame it like that before we talk more about burnout, because that's a very familiar state, I think, for a lot of us, but quite a common state that we all pass through at various points.
Yeah, I found that idea of energy and tension a really helpful one to do. You can always map it, can't you, as a sort of quadrant, you know, four sort of quadrants. I think it's really helpful.
Everything can be explained by a 2x2 grid. It's a basic feature of consulting.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you a bit about the burnout then. It feels to me like it's one of those phrases that is just bandied around so much that we sort of have a vague general idea of what it is, but perhaps don't have a much more sort of precise understanding of what it is. So, you know, to me, it feels like sometimes it's almost interchangeable with exhaustion, or with just having too much stress. But I wonder, is there a kind of clearer definition that we should sort of think about here?
Yeah, the short answer is no. So the World Health Organization definition specifically relates to sustained workplace stress that isn't managed. So they actually only really talk about it in the workplace context, but actually your mind doesn't really distinguish between workplace and other types of stress. So not sure that that's hugely helpful. A lot of the time, the thing that pushes us into feeling overwhelmed is a combination of work and other things, the moving house, for example, whilst also managing stressful work deadlines, that kind of thing can push you over a bit. So that there've been various attempts to define it over the decades. It's all pretty imprecise. There've been some attempts to sort of subcategorize it as well. So that there is one model that I dug out that distinguishes between frenetic and under-challenged and worn out as three different types. So one being so busy that you're kind of running out of steam because you've got so much going on, so it becomes a kind of nervous inability to focus or to make progress. Under-challenged meaning feeling demoralized, demotivated, not really feeling like you've got anything to get your teeth into, or worn out just being that you've got lots of things that you could be doing, and it might be good if you weren't feeling so completely exhausted. And they all kind of get mixed in together. And I think what's been happening a lot over the last 8 or 9 months is people talking about burnout, but actually we're sort of converging on that same sense of being burnt out from different directions. Some people are very under-challenged. They're sitting around feeling useless, feeling that they can't do the things that they're good at, and they haven't got the opportunities to engage and make progress on things. Other people are running ragged, trying to do too many things and worrying about all the stuff. And in the background, we've got this sort of sense of tension and uncertainty about everything. And so people who've been on furlough for months and people who've been trying to keep small businesses afloat are ending up feeling broadly the same and can relate to each other's experiences, which is interesting.
Yeah, I read this lovely thing the other day. Well, not lovely, but really good description that really spoke to me. And it was somebody who said that fatigue or exhaustion is something that happens to your body, but burnout exhausts your soul. And I think that to me, I was like, wow, that totally nails it, because it's that feeling of almost like remoteness. It's different to exhaustion, isn't it? It's kind of like goes almost beyond exhaustion to the point where you kind of just lose a connection with everything.
Yeah, that sense of distance from tasks is quite a common element of it, and a loss of productivity that comes with that. It speaks a bit to some of the themes we've talked about in previous sessions about, I guess, the relationship between stress and motivation, that actually sometimes being really excited about things is a cause of stress, because you really want things to go well, you want it to be good, and then you can't do it effectively. And then the easiest thing to reduce your stress is just to stop caring, to go, you know what, I just can't do anything about this. I'm just going to play Animal Crossing. What the hell, I don't care anymore. And so you can arrive at that point of feeling detached and disengaged, sometimes because you're genuinely not very interested in what you have to do, but equally because you really care about what you've got to do, but it's too much, it's overwhelming you. But it feels broadly the same, because it's that demoralized sense of like, well, I don't even know where to start with this.
Yeah, and yet there's something in burnout that just makes you carry on, isn't it? The exhaustion is like you just keel over, but burnout is like, okay, I've raided that emergency. I mean, I always think about it as that, I have this kind of emergency box of energy. And I certainly know for myself that I raid that energy box far too often. But there's something about burnout, I think, where you just think, I've got to carry on. It's like, you're exhausted, but it's just relentless, isn't it?
It's sort of part of the difficulty is often not being able to rest. So the feeling of that what you really need is to stop and take some time out, but you can't. And so it's that sense of pushing yourself on, even though you're not at your best, you're not really making progress. And then, of course, if your productivity's hit, things take longer. So actually you end up working longer hours to achieve the same amount. So it can become a bit of a vicious circle. And I mean, it relates a bit to, and I can see the comment in the chat there about, could depression be an aspect of it? And it's exactly right, that to some extent what happens is that chronic sense of being tense and alert and having to keep doing things results in depletion of resources, and you can end up feeling really tired. But equally, if you're tired and very uncomfortable and fed up, it can shift your mood and it can slowly turn into depression, and that makes it very hard to then climb out of it. It's not to say that we've all got depression, though. I think a lot of people I speak to are experiencing a sense of lethargy, but not really feeling despairing. That's sort of one part of the depressive symptoms, but not that feeling of hopelessness or can't enjoy anything. It's more just not really having enough energy, which is a component of it. But the key with depression and with other mood disorders is that they persist after the situation improves. So if you are actually in a bad situation, then feeling down about it may be perfectly rational. If later on you find that things have improved, things open back up, work gets better, and you're still feeling that sense of lethargy and feeling fed up, that may point to it being more about your inner mood and depression. And similarly with feeling anxious a year from now, if everything is safe and you still feel nervous going to the shops, it points to it being your mood that is, you know, on high alert rather than actually there being a threat right now.
And we've talked a little bit about the kind of, you know, the external causes of it, you know, it's just, you know, like the World Health Organization is about kind of chronic work-related stress. But and obviously that within the mix as well, there's kind of a lack of control, and that sort of detachment, that kind of breaking down of a sense of community, those sorts of things. But I wonder if we were to think more sort of internally and think about the sort of psychological makeup of people, and what are there sort of aspects of our psychology that make us more prone to burnout, or is it just all external factors that sort of... Oh, Andy, you're muted, sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, sorry, hardware struggles. Yeah, it's sort of, I think some of it is there's not really any reason people are immune to it. It's more about different things will press people's buttons differently. So it's, I think thinking of it as a variety of different things that might cause people to feel stretched or stressed or overwhelmed, rather than this person seems to be immune and I'm having all these problems. It may well be that there's another situation, a different set of circumstances that would make that person who seems to be fine in this circumstance feel just as bad as you do now. And of course, we're not all experiencing the same things as well. So actually, if you've got, you know, different experiences of work, different things that are going on in your industries, that kind of thing can make a big difference. So a lot of it is just about being a bit gentler with ourselves and realizing that this is tough. This isn't like there's something wrong with us. Having said that, there's things that we can do. So part of it is about mindset stuff, about being able to focus on what you can control, thinking about opportunities to learn and change, and particularly trying to stay attached to the way that you think things should be rather than responding to the world as it is can be very exhausting. You can maintain it. It's that sense of holding a vision and pushing it through, but we all know from doing that it's tiring to do that and will deplete you faster than just going, you know what, I don't really mind what I do. Let's change and respond to whatever's happening right now. Just go with the flow. So some of it is about how attached and motivated you are to try and make a certain thing happen, and the commitment that you have to that, which isn't a negative, it's just is tiring. But then there's other aspects of it which might be to do with your well-being habits, whether you're looking after yourself. You know, some basic physical aspects affect your mood as well. So your mood will be very influenced by things like diet, exercise, social contact, the kind of basic building blocks and good habits that we have, which can act as a bit of a defense, which is why you'll see a lot of articles that are about reducing burnout being about like doing nice things for yourself, going for walks, having a routine. It's not that those things solve the problem, it's that they provide a bit of a buffer to restore your energy, reduce your tension. These breathers and restorers can act as a little bit of a release valve when things are difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting for me in all of that is, you know, the idea that we've talked about this before, but in the creative sector, you know, we care about what we do so much, and it's so closely tied up with our sense of identity. That thing you've just talked about, you know, the being attached to the way you want things to be, I think is a particular issue for us, or for lots of us anyway. And I think with that kind of, you know, that care and that sort of, you know, the stuff around identity as well, it means that we can be, I know certainly know quite a few perfectionists as well, and I think that can have an impact on your ability to kind of, you know, protect yourself from burnout.
Yeah, and that relates a little bit to personality, which will affect you know, the way that you react to things. And there's the two key ingredients there are conscientiousness and sensitivity, or neuroticism as it's sometimes called. That being very attached to there being a right way to do things, is high conscientiousness, often translates to success in life and work, working to long-term goals, and so it is generally a positive thing, at least in terms of productivity or being able to succeed. And that speaks a little bit to the comments in the chat about knowing when to give up on things. If you are very persistent, if you do want to keep pushing through, that can be a really positive thing, because you eventually get there. Of course, there are lots of people who don't, and you never read about them in the papers. So just bear in mind that we often see the success stories rather than the failures. But the sensitivity element is also important, that how strongly you feel negative emotions or are affected by negative experiences. And that perfectionism is often a combination of the two. It's not just about really wanting to get things the way that you think is right. It's also about how upset you get when they're not like that. And so the choice to be upset or the feeling of being disappointed by it is not necessarily inbuilt into striving for it. You can just strive to make things better without being worried that they're not perfect. But it's that combination point that's a particular problem.
I think I've mentioned this before, but I read that, there's this thing about if you consistently try and put a 13 amps worth of energy through a 3 amp fuse, then it's just going to burn. But you put a new fuse in, you do it again, and I think there's a little bit of that perhaps for some of us around sort of burnout. You just don't learn the lessons. It sort of picks up on what Michael was saying in the chat about knowing when to stop. And I think that's something you just have to learn to recognize yourself, isn't it? And try and spot the warning signs. I have, just picking up on what Michael said, like, there are, I know that I don't always recognize the signs, but I have a really good friend who does. So she's now on kind of like spotting duty. So she will tell me when I'm getting to the point where things are about to tip over into the wrong side of the scale almost. That could be quite useful, I think.
It is also interesting, I think. I met a guy once who worked for Ray Dolby for years ago, with Dolby surround sound, and he said you could read Ray Dolby's autobiography and you could see him talking about the struggles of trying to get things off the ground and the eventual successes. But what you don't see from it, unless you are actually with him on the journey, is that for most of that time he was occasionally thinking he might have lost his mind and wasted his entire life doing something completely pointless, and that feeling of doubt of like, maybe this is just me being delusional, it creeps in for if you're trying to enact a vision and you hit roadblocks. So it's quite hard to know when to say, actually, am I being crazy? But other people can really help with that. But I did want to say, I mean, you mentioned sort of the things that are going on with this. Part of this is it affects creativity. So I do think it is harder if your job involves trying to come up with ideas and be creative, because burnout will really hit you on that capacity, because creativity relies so much on energy and motivation, that mental capacity to think things through. So it may be that actually what other people would experience as just not liking their job and just going through the motions, actually for a creative industries person makes it impossible to work, because you just haven't got access to the core thing that you do as your main practice. So it perhaps is felt a bit more deeply. But I was curious, because we talked around a bit about how people are feeling in the creative industries, and I'm curious to know from your perspective and the people that you're talking to, and I'm curious to hear from people on the chat as well about whether there's a particular thing happening in the creative sector, whether burnout's more common here, whether it's different for creative people. What are you noticing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the last month there's been a noticeable sort of shift in people's energy, and there's a sort of weariness. And I think we've talked before about, way back at the beginning, people were talking about this idea of there being a kind of team now and a team next. And there were some people who were going to be really, we had that kind of capacity surge at the beginning where everybody, was feeling almost, some people I know were feeling almost kind of like energized by the crisis and what that sort of brought with it. But I think that, some people were team now back then, and some people were team next. Some people have been both team now and team next. Some people haven't been any of that. But I think we've all been going through it all of the time. And so that thing around, this isn't burnout that's just induced by kind of overwork. It's a whole load of things. And I think that amongst the people that I work with, the kind of the risks of freelancing that are always there, that are inherent in that kind of life, just feel much more apparent, and the financial precariousness of having a career in the arts feels much more acute now. People are losing their jobs, the jobs just aren't out there. But I think perhaps more than anything, it's just this sense, everybody's feeling this kind of sense of powerlessness and this loss of control. But in the creative sector, it just feels like there are just ever shifting goalposts. You just get used to doing this and you gear yourself psychologically to kind of going back and bringing things back and everything. And then it gets ripped out from you. And then you go into lockdown and all those sort of things. So I think shifting goalposts. And then you've got that whole identity thing, which is so important. But I suppose the other thing that I really noticed, and I've noticed it this week because it's London Jazz Festival, and normally London Jazz Festival to me signifies end of the year, moving towards Christmas, lovely time, very sociable, that sort of thing. And so it struck me when I was thinking about today's talk that for a lot of us, our coping mechanisms are also going out, going to see things, going to see work, that sort of thing. And all of that's also been taken away. So it's like what we do during the day is difficult. And then the stuff that we do in the evenings to kind of, relieve the tension isn't there either. So I think that's probably a bit of what's going on there. And I think then you've got this kind of isolation, that's even more acute than it is normal. I think all of those sorts of things are compounding it. Not to make a special case, but I have.
And I can see people in the chat talking about it, and it's partly that, the feeling that your mind isn't there makes more anxiety as well. That feeling of, actually, if I did get opportunities, I can't respond to them like I used to, and we're not getting so many ideas. I mean, I've said before though that the creative industry's work seems to be incredibly important for people in coping with lockdown, and yet a lot of it has been shut down and cut, and so it's quite hard to see where that new spark of creativity and ideas come from, not just for producing new content to go on Netflix, which a lot of the world is worried about right now, but where do creative people get their ideas from, except through hanging out with other creative people, going to other forms of art, getting inspiration from that. So it becomes a collective thing for us to try and keep that going as well.
Yeah, I think we talked about this, didn't we, when we were in the session about creativity, about just moving away from the stuff that you're stuck on and actually being creative in a different way. I remember somebody saying, I'm a painter, but I do little biro drawings. But anything that kind of gets your creative juices flowing, and then it was lovely after last month's session where we, on World Mental Health Day, we did one of those talks and people gave us some lovely feedback. And I know that I certainly go back to those little kind of, email messages that just give me that kind of confidence and that kind of sense of, actually, what I'm doing is important. Purpose gives you energy, doesn't it? We've talked about that before. So having that little folder on your computer that you can look at when you're feeling a bit like, what's the point? I think can be really, really useful as well. The other thing I suppose that I think is key, certainly for me, is that the isolation. There's that phrase about you're the average of the 5 people that you spend most of your time with. Some of you will know that I've just moved house, and at the weekend we had a builder in the house, and my dad popped round because he's in our bubble. So there were 4 people, and I thought, God, I don't know the last time I was in a room with 4 people. And afterwards, I was in such a good mood, and I realised it was just because there was a proper conversation that was going on that wasn't just 2 people, And it was amazing the amount of energy I got from that. And so, I think it's when you're on your own and you're reliant on your own kind of patterns of behaviour and thinking, it's easier to forget to kind of cut yourself some slack. You just harden, you put pressure on yourself, don't you? And I think that things like that, certainly my hope is that talks like this help you to understand that other people are going through it and that it's a thing and that there are things that you can do to make it better. I think just being on your own with it is just really hard.
Yeah, it's one of the things I think to bear in mind with it as well, is that it feels like we've been doing this for years now, and actually it's been 8-9 months, and so the impact it's had has been very rapid, and then we're sort of stuck in this holding pattern. But we'll maybe come on to a bit about the specifics of COVID, but one of the things about it is that feeling that it's not a permanent change. It's a temporary thing. So how much should we adjust? How much should we get used to it? How much should we plan for the future? How much do we need to deal with things right now? So just that ambiguity is very confusing for your system to know how to respond. Is this an emergency? Is this just something that you need to go, oh, I'll accept it? Do you fight against it and try and push through for a vision? Do you not? I've experienced this from my involvement with venues, trying to help them through it, is, do you spend loads of time trying to adjust to a COVID model of running events, or do you just not bother and close? And for offices, I've got clients who spent huge amounts of time and money trying to get their offices COVID safe, and then as soon as they opened their offices, there was another lockdown and they had to send everyone home, and they could have just probably not bothered. And so it's, where does the energy need to go is quite unclear.
Yeah, it's interesting. Carol's just put there in the chat, that she thinks the skills we're learning during this period are useful when we go back to normal, whatever that's going to look like. And I think
it's very good, Carol. Good growth mindset there.
And it's true, isn't it? It's a little bit hard to kind of remember that when you're in the thrust of it, but it is true. I'm just thinking back to myself about the ways that I've sort of adapted and things like that. If you can hold on to that in the moment, then it is, there is a bit of a sort of silver lining to the cloud. But you mentioned the kind of the special, the kind of specifics of COVID, and I know that there is increasing chatter about sort of COVID induced sort of burnout, and I just wondered what the chatter is about, how COVID is causing burnout to morph. We've talked a little bit about that, but it might be useful to explore that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, there's a lot of different stuff being written. There's a few articles that I think particularly picked out for me is explaining how I felt. I'm not quite sure if they're completely representative of everyone else, but the two concepts that I think have been quite helpful. One is the idea of surge capacity, which I think Anne Maston at the University of Minnesota talks about. And essentially what's going on with stress is that it's you've got all these systems that kick in when you've got an urgent threat, things that you need to respond to. But what they're doing is borrowing from the future. So you're dealing with the present by robbing your future self of energy and resources. And so you can't sustain it indefinitely. And the problem that we have is if we are responding with surge capacity and we're suddenly getting all this energy and we do all this stuff, that's really only for short-term threats. And the problem with COVID is that, of course, it's both an imminent and immediate possible threat, in that case numbers suddenly will rocket, and suddenly you can find illness is immediately there, and there's all these changes going on. But it's also not going away anytime soon. It's not like we can just push through it and solve the problem. We're kind of waiting for other people to solve it and checking the news about vaccine distributions and all that kind of thing. So our surge capacity has run out, and we're still trying to operate at that stressed state of responding to threats, which is very problematic. The other thing that I think is quite a helpful concept is the idea of ambiguous loss, which is a concept that you find through for example, the trauma of someone going missing, but you never know what happened to them. It's where there's not a kind of a thing that has happened that you can complete and you can go, right, that's done, I'm going to process that. You've got this uncertainty about what it is that you need to process. And so for a lot of us, I think it's not just saying I've lost a load of things. It's I've lost, but I might get it back. I'm not sure whether I'm losing, whether I need to let this go and grieve, whether I need to fight to keep it, and what we can do about that. And so I think it's leaving a lot of us in this sort of slight state of spinning wheels of not being quite sure what we actually need to process here. And looking back at, for example, the Spanish flu 100 years ago, the general backdrop, I suppose, was of theatres, for example, closing for a couple of years. So Broadway in New York was pretty much shut down for a couple of years. But it's not like Broadway ceased to exist. It came back, and you wouldn't know a few years later that had happened, except for all the troubles that it caused for people during that period. It's more the trauma of that experience than the long-lasting shift in how the theatres work in Broadway. So it's how do we process that? And thanks, Julia. Yeah, ambiguous loss. It's sort of Schrodinger's trauma. It's like you're not sure whether this is whether it's alive or dead. What is happening? I can't figure out. So in my case, for example, we've done a lot of work over the years to develop more digital tools. We have no real idea whether we're going to be mainly a digital business now, or if I'm suddenly going to go back to doing a lot of talks and conference gigs and face-to-face training. So I don't really know how to prepare for it. All I can really do, as a few people have been talking about, is just try and prepare for lots of things, or try and develop options. And so it's almost like we're trying to prepare for not knowing what's going on, rather than trying to prepare for a thing that we know we can do something about.
Yeah. I've been reading quite a lot about this idea of decision fatigue, that there are just, I'm certainly conscious of this, there are just so many more decisions that are now, things that never used to be things are, there's a lot of things in this, are things, disinfecting your shopping, and, all the kind of crazy things that we started to get involved in. It feels like there are loads of decisions that either we didn't know that we were taking, that just feel very big. So that feels like something that's special about now. And then also, I just wondered about, the kind of the hierarchy of needs. It feels like suddenly lots of us are thinking about more of the kind of the base ones, rather than, worrying about, kind of like those first world problems that we used to worry about. It just feels like things are a lot more fundamental.
No, we need sovereignty. Sovereignty is what we really need. Not a vaccine, but sovereignty.
So, yeah. So, and then I think the other thing is this, I don't mind admitting, I still have a really messy cutlery drawer. I haven't done anything with my cutlery drawer, but, that for months, I just couldn't admit that in public, because there was almost like this kind of competition. People were just doing lots around sort of personal development and that sort of thing. So I think for some people, there's just this sense like, wow, God, it's as much as I can do to get up, go to work, look okay, function like a human being. I haven't got time or the energy to learn Mandarin, or so I don't know, some of that is going on as well, I think, in this kind of special COVID version of burnout.
Yeah, and it's of course worth just stating again that this is a really big deal. This is not like some minor setback that we should just get over ourselves and do more yoga and we'll be fine. It is a major event that we're going through, and puts a lot of the other things that we might have been stressed about in the past into a bit of context. Really, it's making a lot of people, I think, say, well, actually, now that I think about it, what I actually think is important is some basic things about how I live, making sure that my family are okay, seeing my friends. There's a lot of sort of back to basics feeling going on of like, actually, now I come to think of it, I can't remember what I was stressed about before the pandemic. I have no idea what was I so worried about then. I was worried about something, but who knows what it is, because now I'm busy trying to make sure that my parents are alive. It's a completely different focus we've got.
Remember that thing called Brexit? That was a thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's going to be what a wonderful timing it's going to be for this, and I think
Exactly.
there's been a lot of writing about the effect of that on the creative industries as well, which is, I think, an extra burden. Some people are much more affected by COVID than other industries. So some people are going to be more affected by Brexit than others. The creative industries is getting hit by both, I think, in quite an unusual way.
Yeah. So the $6 million question, Andy, what can we do to keep burnout at bay? We were saying before everybody else joined, we've got to nail this one, no pressure. Any thoughts on, you said things that could just make it a little bit easier, but no pressure to come up with the total answer.
Yeah, and it's been nice seeing some of the comments in the chat as well about the things people are doing. I suppose one thing that it's not particularly a kind of, there's not a scientific way of expressing it really, but try to simplify as much as possible that's been my main technique. So the rather than trying to preserve all of the different things that you were doing, all the different things that you had, all the things that you offered, just go cut right back, do the things that you can do reliably, and drop everything else. So one of the first things that I did with our organization was close our office, because I just thought, I don't want to be managing an office during all this, so I'll just close it and we'll go to working from home, and we'll just adjust to that, and now I don't have to think about the office. Similarly, I didn't make any effort to train up our trainers in how to deliver face-to-face training in a COVID safe way. I just said, we don't offer that. We'll do everything online. So just focusing in on doing a few things that you can do well, rather than trying to spread yourself too thin. Another thing is the buffers of breathers and restorers, which is the thing that I think there's been a lot more talk about during all this, about the things that are keeping us going, the things that allow us to connect with people, things that keep us physically well, things that give us a bit of creative outlet or inspiration, things basically to raise your energy and reduce your tension. If you make those things habitual, then that can act as a bit of a buffer. The third one, which is a bit harder though, is we need to find ways to feel safe, because you can't really come out of that surge state, that sense of high alert, unless your mind goes, okay, I'm not being attacked right now. And that will be different for different people, but trying to figure out ways that you can give your mind a clear signal that it's all right to switch off for a while, that's the hard bit right now, but that's what we really need. So whether that's about making decisions about deferring certain things to next year and taking the rest of this year to just go, I'm not going to solve anything right now, I'm just going to look after me, or finding ways to figure out what's the essential things that you need to have control over and get them under control and let the rest go. There's essentially two sides to the equation. You can either try and reduce the threats, so reducing the uncertainty, the things that you're worried might happen, or you can build up your capacity and your resources. You can try and give yourself more tools to be able to deal with all that. Either one of those, you get that ratio a bit more in balance, your mind will start to go, oh, okay, maybe it's all right for me to just sleep and enjoy myself for a while, and then you start to get your energy back.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot in there, isn't there? I think the key thing in there that you just said, then you can allow yourself. And I think, this idea of giving yourself permission and to kind of not be, 100% or even 80% or whatever of your normal capacity, because this is just acknowledging that how big this is. It's huge, isn't it? And acknowledging that, I think, is the first stage. But I think when I was thinking about this, this idea of like how hard it is to practice self-care unless when there's nobody around you, kind of, or when you're just relying on yourself. And it's a bit like a car. If a car can't run without fuel, and you can't run without energy, But the only thing that seems to, because I know that it kind of empirically and from a theoretical point of view, but the thing that sort of chimes with me is the idea that I can't give what I haven't got. So if I haven't got any energy, I can't give it. And I am someone that likes to give and likes to help. So the only way that I can make sense of it, and this is, I'm sure this isn't healthy, is to think, okay, well, if I haven't got the energy, then I can't be there for other people. It's like thinking like the aeroplane, isn't it? You know, put your mask on first so that you can help other people. So that I think is something for me in terms of like keeping burnout at bay, is just kind of practicing that self-care. And I can remember years ago, I said to somebody, I have to put in my diary, do nothing. And they laughed at me, but it was the only way that I could make doing nothing something. And now I have a thing on my wall that says say no more. Like I've almost got to the point where I want to kind of set myself a daily target of saying no, like at least twice or something. That to me is also quite useful.
That's the simplification thing again, you know, that feeling of being able to give a clear and unambiguous no, of like, no, not doing that, and forget it, rather than feeling like everything just gets onto your list. You know, it's really important when you've got scarce resources, when you're operating on fumes, you know, to only do a few things.
Yeah. Is there something in here about the sort of the specificity of it? You know, like so we're all very different. And what's behind the burnout will be very different as well. And so, you know, I quite like, often when I'm stuck on something, I would just keep asking myself, why is this? Why is it this? Why isn't this? And using that kind of the power of why, I find really, you know, just find that really useful. So trying to get a real handle on, you know, and what it is that is the root cause of this for me, that feels really important as well.
Yeah, I think what I've been finding is that I've got certain things that I just get stuck on. And so trying to figure out why those things and not other things. But I think a lot of it is, it's not so much that those things are impossible. It's simply that if your energy is dropping, you know, if you're running out of resources, then there will be a few things that just seem to require a bit more thought, a bit more, you know, risk, a bit more worry. You know, if you're worried about getting something wrong and putting something out into the world and you're like, okay, I've got to get this right, you may get stuck on that. So it's not necessarily those particular things. It's more just that they're the bits that you feel require a little bit more effort than some of the other things on your list. So you'll gravitate towards the things that you can do without really making much effort, because it just feels like making progress. And so these things, sort of these other things I'm putting off, sit there taunting me, making me feel like I haven't done anything, when in fact I probably have done quite a lot. I'm only thinking about the one thing I haven't done.
Yeah, and it's about adjusting your expectations, isn't it, as well? It definitely took me a few months to realize, actually, you know, I'm working harder probably than I would do normally, and all of this is going on at the same time. And even if it's kind of at the back, you know, it's quite easy to sit at home and just carry on and be busy, but there's still all of this going on, even if you're not kind of thinking about it consciously, isn't there? So the other thing that I just wanted to mention that was certainly useful to me when I think I've mentioned this before, I took a sabbatical a few years ago, and I started to think about, I wanted to write myself some going back to work guidelines. So I started to think about the way that I employ myself. And I don't know if this chimes for lots of other people, but if anybody else employed me in the way that I employ myself, I would have, you know, jumped ship years ago. I just forget sometimes, you know, to put myself on the to-do list almost. And so what I found really useful was writing myself a set of work guidelines. But I found that when I was saying, I will do this and I will do that, it just, you know, I will do this, I will finish at 4 o'clock, I will do this, I will, you know, all those things, they just didn't ring true. And the only way I could make them feel kind of realistic was writing about it in the third person, as if I was the employer and I was doing this for somebody else. And then the dynamic totally changed. And so I've been experimenting with that a little bit recently, to just go, okay, you need to, you know, I will do this, I will make sure that Julia does this, I will make sure that changes it for me. I don't know if other people would find that helpful.
Yeah, I really like that. I think part of it is that sense of self-compassion that we talked about previously, but it's quite a good way of thinking of it as, you know, how are you being as a boss to yourself? You know, if you do work for yourself, then take that relationship seriously. You know, think about what kind of relationship you want to have with your staff, including you. I think is a very nice way of reminding ourselves to be compassionate and treat ourselves with respect as well.
Yeah,
and that's something that I've been told many times, is that you are the first asset on your business plan. You are the first person that needs to be in good shape for your business to thrive. Otherwise, you have no business. You know, and so it's good business sense, as we've said all along with these talks, you know, to do that.
The last thing I'd been thinking about was this idea of operating from sort of a position of sort of self-trust, like trusting that you will get through this, that you have the wherewithal to do it, even though it might not feel like it. Um, and I think that speaks to what you've been saying about simplifying things. And somebody was saying, I've just changed my expectations now from, I don't need to do all these things that used to be important. Now what's important is that I can pay the bills and keep my family safe. Those sorts of things I think are so important, aren't they? Just, shifting your kind of expectations of yourself. Really important.
Yeah, so much of this is where you put your attention. If you are focusing on the things that you're losing, the things that you feel under threat, then you'll spend a lot of time worrying about that. But if there are things that are under control, that you feel like they're safe, that's all right, then focusing on that can make you feel a bit more solid. But there's always things that we can't control, and there are always things that we could be worrying about. It's just trying to figure out how to keep that rational. And just to go back to the moods versus emotions thing, it's part of that is why mood management is quite important, is that what it helps to do is to identify when the things that you're preoccupied with are no longer in the world but in your mind, and so the things that you're reacting to are in inner things, part of your inner world, rather than actually the world around you. Because that kind of rumination, worry, it can feel like it's keeping you safe, but often it just distracts you from the actual threats and things that you need to keep an eye on around you in the world. It becomes detached from that. And so that's the thing to keep an eye on, is if you're worrying about things, make sure that they're real things, because otherwise you can end up spending a lot of energy preoccupied with something that might not happen, and forget to actually fix something that's really important that you do need to be attending to. So it's a myth that it makes you feel safer, but it doesn't necessarily make you safer.
Yeah. There's some brilliant stuff. I mean, you're keeping an eye on that, so some brilliant stuff coming up in the chat. And what I will do is kind of pull all of that together and make sure that we share that in a blog, because there's some amazing insights and things being shared there. But I talked before about this idea of burnout, feeling almost like it's about not having enough and being detached, and a sense of kind of withdrawal. A little bit from people, from connections, and from everything. I've been thinking a lot about. There used to be this phrase that Jazz FM used, which was "live in color," or I think it might have been "listen in color." But it was, and this idea of living in color to me feels really important right now. Because everything is just, it's just been going on for so long, hasn't it? And we need some color and something that's nourishing. But one of the things that I think, one of the lovely things that's happened from us starting this balance series, is this sense of community that's beginning to build. And I wanted to open up, I'm going to come back and ask you a question, Andy, but I wanted to open up at this point and ask people how they've been connecting with people. I've seen lots of people saying about feeling isolated, but how have they been connecting with people to keep their spirits up over the last few months? So it would be great if you could share some of those ideas, inventive, imaginative uses of Zoom or WhatsApp or whatever it is. It would be great to see those, and then there might be some things that we can kind of help each other out with there. But Andy, this thing about connecting with people, why is it that in every talk that we've done, I think you've talked about the power of connection, the power of reaching out, and even helping other people can help when you're going through tough times. And so, in the context of burnout, when you're exhausted but you feel like you've got to keep trying, what is it about connecting with other people that's useful?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it, that when you've got too much to do yourself, that you should do something for someone else. It feels like the last thing you'd want to do. And it does show up a lot in the research around compassion, about whether we tend to be quite naturally compassionate and empathetic and care about other people, but it's harder to feel that when we don't feel safe ourselves. So essentially, the more threatened we get, the less we start to help each other, and the more that sort of breaks down. And so this is one of the big problems and risks with sustained difficult circumstances like this. It's one of the strange things, is the myth of the Blitz spirit, as if everyone in London just all sang songs around the piano for the whole of 1940 and 41. But in fact, what was going on was a much more mixed bag of, when a bomb fell on a corner shop, the people from 2 streets over would come and loot it, and the people from the street that the corner shop was on would come and defend it, and it went very tribal, and all this sort of strange stuff that you see happening with it. So I think part of the purpose of helping people is to break that vicious circle, that you want to try and go out and do things that are good for other people, because it spreads that feeling that we have resources, and it makes other people more likely to help in turn. So it creates a spiral upwards out of that, to make sure that people feel like actually someone's been supporting me, so maybe I have got time to help my neighbor out, and it creates that kind of spirit of it. And it's what there's a nice phrase in there of that kind of that came in the chat. I think I've lost it now, but the sense of scarcity, that sort of background feeling of scarcity, as a powerful scarcity undercurrent was the phrase, which is a lovely phrase of putting it. And so it helps to reorientate our focus to not just thinking we're all pitted against each other to try and get the last roll of toilet paper. It's actually that our neighbours probably all have spare toilet paper now, and we can share it, and it's that's one of the key things for collectively getting through this. And generally the other bit that I think's underrated about trying to support other people is that it makes you focus on what you can offer, which actually flips your mind into thinking about what you have rather than what you haven't got. So if you think, what could I do to help this person? What your mind will start doing is an audit of all the assets that you've got and the skills that you've got available to you. And that mindset is very helpful for being able to feel like you can then come back to your to-do list thinking, actually, maybe I have got some things to bring to this. Maybe it's not completely hopeless. So it's as much about that mindset reorientation as it is about the effect that it has on other people as well.
Yeah. And I think it's give and take, isn't it? I mean, I know that so I mentor quite a few people. I've been running action learning sets, and ostensibly to the outside world, they look like acts of kindness and generosity on my part, but actually I know that I get a tremendous amount back from doing that. Just closing the door at the end of the day and thinking, well, I've done some good today, and people have connected, and but I suppose the other thing, just going back to what I said earlier, is this idea that other people can help you and spot things about you that you don't recognize yourself. So my friend Rachel, quite often I will say, okay, I'm just going to put you on that special alert that you need to go on sometimes. Just keep an eye on me. If I start to sound like I've lost the plot a little bit, then just tell me, because then I know what to do, but I may not recognize it myself. But so those conversations with other people can also lead you to realize that you might be kind of wandering off the path a little bit. But the other thing, I suppose, as well, is that it jolts you out of yourself, doesn't it? We talked about being nourished and things like that. It's just about, I was really so struck on Saturday by that idea of just different people's voices and conversations that were going on that weren't just me talking to one other person in a room. So there's something about just being reminded of the world out there that's so important when we're all sort of stuck at home. Seems important to me, because you draw energy from other people, don't you, as well? So yeah,
it's one of the stranger things about this is that a lot of the time when there's a big event like this, it's experienced collectively and we're all together, which means that if you're feeling flat, someone else has got high energy, and it evens out a bit. It's much harder when we're all sent to our rooms and dealing with it separately. So trying to find ways to get that collective sense of that we have resources that we can sort of bring each other along when we're feeling a bit fed up. That's I think what we're all trying to reach for in all these Zoom drinks and webinars and attempts to connect. It's looking around going, is everyone feeling as broken as me, or like could someone help me get inspired today, and like please give me some energy, and please give me a sense that we're not coping on this alone. We've got other people around us who can help us, and that is true. We're all in this together, but it just doesn't always feel like it. So reminding ourselves of that and the amount of work that's going on, even just the news about vaccines is helpful, just to remind yourself that actually loads of people are doing work on this, and we don't even have to do anything. They'll just sort it out for us, and it's sort of nice, I suppose.
Yeah. There's some lovely things coming up in the chat. You'll have seen them as well. There's, writers' salons, some digital, some not digital. So it's great to know. We were talking last night about should we do another living room disco just before Christmas, because that was a really nice thing for me, certainly. So I wonder if now is a good time to just bring Abby in and just see. It looks like from what I've been looking at the chat, there have been quite a few questions flying in. But Abby, would you be happy to join us and share any questions that you've spotted?
I have. I think, to be honest, I think Andy has been answering them as long as they went along. So there's just been a lot of tips and chat. I think Andy has actually answered them as going along. So Andy's had one eye on the chat as well. So if anyone else has anything now, then please shout.
Yeah, do. We'll just have a quick scoot up and down the
yeah, or if we missed something, because I think there were a couple of things I didn't pick out. So
yeah,
if we missed your question, then repost it and we'll try and answer it.
Yeah. But there's some great suggestions here.
Yeah, one thing actually that I did pick up is somebody asked whether routine was always a good, healthy thing to have, or it might be different for each person. Because one person was saying the variety of each day affects their well-being if they're too kind of same every single day.
Yeah, but I mean, it's something we talked about a bit in the session on creativity. Is that to some extent routine is very helpful for productivity, for keeping you going. You know, particularly if you've got good habits around self-care and organizing tasks and that kind of thing. The bit that slightly skews that is that a lot of the techniques for being creative can be about breaking those things, changing routines, shifting your mindset, getting out of those habits. So I wouldn't necessarily think of it as like it has to be either good or bad. It's more that a lot of the things that we do are unconscious and habituated, and so we'll just do them. And so making sure that you have that as a sort of, to use a creative analogy, a sort of good drumbeat and baseline underscoring everything. But that doesn't mean that you just want to get stuck with only that, where everything that you do every day is something that you did the previous day. It's about that as a framework for them being able to do other things that are new or interesting and different. So I think that's the way that I think routine is helpful for me, is that it provides that kind of set of basics. But I relate to the idea that being just stuck in a rut is not the same as having a nice healthy routine bolstering your interesting work and ideas and creative thinking.
Yeah, one of the things that I found useful at other points is to think about new traditions. So things that you never used to do, but that somehow take the place of things that were important to you that you can't any longer do. And I found that really useful to say, okay, I used to be able to do this, but instead I'm going to do this. And you give that the meaning. And that, I think, can fall into that idea of new routines in a way that's really, really healthy. But that idea, I think it does feel like everybody's just going, okay, this is just getting bored. You know, it's so boring now. The novelty's worn off. And so I think this idea of just finding ways to kind of add that color and that nourishment is really important, you know, particularly when we're in lockdown. You know, it does feel different, even if you weren't going out that much before. The fact that you're no longer allowed to somehow changes it, doesn't it? It gives you something to sort of kick against. But for me, yeah, definitely for me, this idea of new traditions has been something that I've come back to lots and lots.
I like the comment in the chat about a rhythm rather than routine. I think that sums it up. That gets to my point better than I said it, really, that I think that the rhythm of life has changed for us, but it can still provide a good backdrop for doing interesting things. It's more that we've been deprived of some of the fun things we want to do than that the routine. It's the fact that we're not able to do these things is making us notice the routine as if that's all there is to life. And it shouldn't be. It should just be a backdrop. It should be a thing that happens to underpin that, you know.
Yeah. There's just another question here as well, saying, are there any ways to help give myself permission to rest or access a more restful mode? I know I should be resting, plan to do something usually restorative for me, but just felt lethargic and lazy.
I'm happy to jump on this. I'm terrible at this. The only thing, I'm ashamed to admit this really, but the only thing that really works for me is thinking about the cost to other people. So if it's for me, you know, it's a bit like that third person thing, you know, I find it very hard to just kind of go, okay, it's really important for you, Julia, that you take some rest. I'm just not wired that way, I don't think. But when I start to think about the consequences of not doing that in terms of other people that I care about and the impact that it will have on my relationships with them and how it might upset them, that's the thing that forces me to get into the self-care, which is a really mixed up way of kind of arriving at the right solution, really. But I've found that's the thing that works for me. Every now and again, I'll go, okay, I'm going to change. I'm going to do this. I'm going to put all those things in my diary. I'm going to write down that I'm going to finish work here. And every time I just kind of, you know, it just doesn't work. And so for me, it's definitely, okay, what are the consequences for other people if you don't do this and for other things that you care about?
I think it's an interesting point that's made there about taking time off and then not feeling like you're able to rest and coming back feeling somehow worse. And I completely relate to that. And I think some of it is, I suppose, distinguishing between things that actually are giving you energy versus things that are just masking how tired or fed up you feel. Because a lot of the things that we do that fill our time allow us to feel like we're okay, but then you stop doing those things and you think, actually, I'm a complete mess. Oh God, right. And so it's the taking time off and stopping actually ends up revealing that, oh yeah, I felt worse than I realized, and it's not this nice restful experience. It's more like staring into the void. But to some extent, that's still better than continuing to sort of spin in the hamster wheel and not address it. So just to some extent, it's about not feeling that there's anything that you have to have got. Maybe the right thing is to spend a week feeling on edge and weird, and to notice that, and to recognize that, and to bring that knowledge into how you then go back to doing things. So it may be that the rest is not fulfilling the role that you wanted it to, of making you feel better, but it is giving you information. It is helping you to figure out where you're at and what you need to do differently. But I think about this when I'm trying to write a book. I will allow myself some time to be completely and utterly useless, because I just know that the way that I work, I have to, if I take 2 weeks to write, the first week of it will be spent with every day feeling guilty that I haven't written anything. And actually, if I just allow myself a week to just feel like I'm really rubbish, then it's slowly my mind starts going, all right, then, okay, if you're not putting me on the spot, maybe I have some ideas, maybe I've got some things to think about. So some of it's just about, letting yourself, have that time of feeling rubbish, and that's okay.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. A lot of work that I do normally is research, and for the first 2/3 of a project, I have absolutely no idea. What I'm doing is getting loads of conflicting data, but you have to go through the mess to kind of arrive at the order. So I'm totally the same on that. But I think what you were saying earlier, Andy, about sometimes you rest, but it's not what you need. For me, that's why kind of really that thing I was talking about asking yourself why, because you can't fix what you don't understand. So if you've not really nailed what it is that is causing this kind of burnout or any kind of uncomfortable kind of mood or whatever that you find yourself in over a longer period of time, if you don't get to the why and the root of it, then you it's like using a hammer when you should be using a screwdriver or something, isn't it? It's just not going to fix it. It's not going to help.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about emotions as information. There's a whole school of thought about the role of emotions being to give us information about what we need to do differently, rather than it being something to be repressed. And one of the best lines that we've found in the research regulation is, it's about knowing how to hang up the phone after getting the message. So you've got to listen to what that is telling you, but you don't want to get stuck just listening to that same message over and over again. You've got to take it and try and do something with it, and show up to the next thing ready to listen to what that's telling you about what you need to do. Otherwise we miss a lot of the other information, because we're still replaying this one thing that we've got stuck on.
I mean, you kind of covered it already, but Vic mentioned something about mentioning concerns about losing skills and getting rusty and being perceived as out of date. Now they've been kind of furloughed or unemployed. And are there any tips to diffuse that feeling? Is that a similar vein to what you were saying earlier?
I suppose on that, so the skills that we have are an important buffer against feeling overwhelmed. So in terms of like what you can do to reduce stress or that feeling of anxiety or overwhelm, then building up your skills and remembering what skills you've got is a really important part of it. So I think the fear of going rusty, losing skills, it speaks exactly to that. It's not just going to make you feel like, oh, I'm worried about, whether I'm going to be as good at my job. It actually contributes to the stress. It can make you feel like, actually, I'm not even going to be able to I can't do anything anymore. I'm losing skills. I'm going backwards in my resources at the point where I need to be growing them. To some extent, this is where I think a few people I've known who've been doing courses or trying to learn things have been feeling better. It's hard to push yourself to do it, but if there are things even just that you can enjoy learning, to remind yourself that you have the capacity to learn. It doesn't have to be something about work. Just learn a thing to remind yourself that actually your mind is quite good at learning things, and that you can adapt and develop skills. Just gives you a bit of faith in your capacity to do it. But it's also where I think people are really struggling with being on furlough, is that feeling of being left out. So some of it may be about volunteering, trying to use what skills you've got to help people. That's where that doing things for other people can help. Feeling useful is a good reminder. Oh yeah, I do have skills after all. But Julia, what are you thinking about that?
Well, I'm just wondering about, not just thinking about the skills, but the other qualities that you have, and and how you can, all those skills, it's a phrase, isn't it, transferable skills, but all those skills that you use in a particular way could be used in other ways. And that sort of speaks to that idea of being useful, but in a way that you're not normally useful. So if you just thinking about how you can apply the skills that you've got in other situations, but also just forcing your focus to be a bit broader and think more generally about the sort of qualities that you have, and the idea, I suppose this speaks a little bit to the idea of being ambitious in other parts of your life as well. It wasn't until my early or probably mid-30s that I realized that ambition wasn't something that you just had professionally, but you should have ambition about your broader life. And so I wonder if there's something in there that's helpful as well. Just thinking, okay, instead of thinking about the skills and the professional thing, how else am I growing? What do I not normally have the chance to notice about myself? And that's again where connecting with other people can be useful, because it's great to nourish on up to you, isn't it?
Yeah, and it definitely, and that feeling of there being good, skills that we're learning from this, that there should be a sense that we're augmenting our capacities rather than taking anything away. That if we were to face a situation where, supposing everything goes back to normal in a year, we will still have learnt a lot of other things that we can do. And what you may well find is that a lot of things start to incorporate the stuff that we've got better at. So it becomes much more normal to work from home more, or to connect digitally, or people have got better tech skills, or people are, better at forming distant communications and contacts and communities. We feel more connected to people who aren't in our geographic area. There might be a lot of ways in which this ends up augmenting our capacity rather than taking it away, but it doesn't feel like that when a lot of the things that we're used to doing aren't available to us. It may just start to feel like that as these other things start to come back and we start realizing that we haven't lost anything permanently, we've just lost it temporarily.
Yeah, and that sort of speaks to, just picking up on what Rachel's just put in the chat there. We've talked about this before, this idea of kind of seasons, and she's saying that over both lockdowns she's noticed that she's gone through this kind of grief cycle of shock, anger, sadness and acceptance, and knowing where she is in that cycle is really important. But we talked, I can't remember which talk it was, but we talked about, just going outside and recognizing that, the leaves are falling off the trees and the colors of the leaves are changing, and that just connects you to this kind of bigger picture, and that somewhere the natural order is continuing and we are part of that, and and the sun will, the moon will come up, the sun will come up, whatever, those cycles are going to continue.
There's a nice point in the chat as well about, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for COVID. And actually, Julia, we've talked about working together for ages, and it was this that prompted us to actually do it. And so a lot of those, if you can even just making contacts with people, doing some things together, just as a little thing to keep going in lockdown, you come back at the end of it and you think, actually, we've built more relationships, we've connected to other people, we've done new things. That may be the thing that ends up with us being able to look back on this as something that helped, but even though it was difficult at the time. I don't think that, for me, a lot of the challenge at the moment is not about trying to thrive, but to protect what we have. It's just about trying to make sure that we minimize the impact on all the stuff that we care about, and that we come out the other side of it with as much as we possibly can. And the first thought I had when there was the news about the vaccine last week, other than isn't that hilarious timing for Donald Trump, was okay, what we've got here is we've got a time limited period where the goal is to save as many people as possible. And so it made a lot more sense for me of why we need a lockdown, that this wasn't an indefinite thing. This is about saying, when that vaccine becomes widely available, how many of our neighbours, our loved ones, are still with us to enjoy what happens after it. That's what we're working towards now. And that makes it feel a little bit more like a positive, a project rather than an indefinite limitation.
I think there's one last, oh, sorry, Abby.
I'm sorry, I was still being question master. Just about communicating burnout with your team. So the use of burnout has become common. I found it hard to be taken seriously about where it was at, which is terrible. But there are viewpoints that communicating needs this clearly.
Gosh, that's a big one. Andy, you might have to get going on that, because I obviously, run my own company. So I would hope that if somebody brought that to, and I'm sure you're the same, that if somebody came to you with that sort of diagnosis or that kind of predicament, that you would be understanding and empathetic. But
yeah, I think it's a problem of the terminology it's not like it's a very specific clinical term or something. It is more general than that. I think to some extent trying to think of the mind as a part of physical systems is helpful, that this isn't just something that is entirely subjective or kind of abstracted. It's part of, you know, your physical body. You know, the mind and the body are very connected, and so being able to understand this in the sense of exhaustion mentally as well as physically, but both have physical components, both are real, both exist, that can help. But it's hard to pin down what's the difference between just feeling tired and what's feeling exhausted or burnt out. What there isn't really a kind of a sharp line on it. But it's the same problem we have with stress, that people use the word stress in all kinds of different ways. Some people say I'm really stressed, and what they mean is I'm annoyed. People have just been getting on my nerves today. Other people say it's great that you're stressed, keeps you going in the morning, because they've confused stress with being excited by things. And someone else is thinking, I haven't slept properly for 2 weeks, and is that good? Am I supposed to feel like that? And, you know, because we use these terms in pretty random throwaway ways. So I wouldn't get too hooked on the particular terms. It's more about trying to explain to people the consequences, the impact, particularly on productivity, on mood, on motivation. I think those things are perhaps easier to talk about than trying to wrap it all up into one big bundle word, which people will often have different interpretations of.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking back to, there was a period after my mum died where I didn't know at the time, but I was experiencing, you know, quite severe depression, and it took the friend that I now have on alert sometimes to say to me, Julia, what you're talking about sounds like depression. And the moment it had a name, I kind of knew what to do with it. And the approach that I took to telling the team about that was one where I you know, it's very typically me. I sort of wanted to then understand everything I could about depression and to really have it sort of nailed down pat. So I found it quite useful to share with the team a very sort of, you know, clear and practical definition of depression and what the symptoms were and how they might show up. And I'm wondering if something like that might be useful as well. Just, you know, there are lots of places where you can go, the NHS, there are lots of websites where they'll give you a kind of clinical sort of definition of the symptoms of burnout or depression or whatever, and that might help in that sort of situation as well.
Yeah, and I think I can see a comment whether you could be diagnosed with burnout by a doctor, and it's sort of generally, I think what a doctor would typically diagnose is either stress or depression, and depending on how it's manifesting. But like essentially, a lot of the way that burnout's thought of is it's the impact of chronic stress. So it would be, I suppose, the way that a doctor might frame it would be that as a result of being under chronic stress, you are experiencing, you know, physical and mental symptoms, you know, problems caused by that. And so it wouldn't be that, you know, so the burnout's a symptom rather than the underlying cause. It's more of a description of the state that you've ended up in, but you can get there through, you know, bereavement, depression. You can get there through being chronically stressed for months. And so it's that would be generally, I think, how a doctor would frame it, is thinking about it in terms of either mood disorders or the impact of just having been in this, you know, a surge capacity state, borrowing from the future for a long time.
There's one final question. Thanks, Abby. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up. But there was one final question about, does mental health awareness training cover this? From memory, the mental health first aid training that I've done didn't cover burnout. It covered, you know, depression and stress and things like that, but it didn't, as you're saying, Andy, cover burnout because it's a sort of symptom rather than the kind of condition. But
a lot of it is this, the thing that's not trained enough, I think, and is what Mindapples focuses on, is all the subclinical stuff, the things that are not really, you know, a diagnosable condition, but are the things that you might notice in the year leading up to getting a diagnosable condition, which is where we want to be focusing a lot more of our support. And the big concern in public health circles at the moment is not that everybody in the country has become anxious or depressed. It's that we're all experiencing the sorts of symptoms which, if left unattended, will eventually lead to people showing up at doctor's office and getting diagnosed with those things. So the work at the moment is, from a public health point of view, is to support people with these things before they become medical issues. And my bugbear with mental health awareness training is that it isn't mental health awareness, it is mental illness awareness training, and it's generally misnamed. So it's very useful if you want to know about the different illnesses that you can have, but what we want to do a lot more of in Mindapples is about understanding mental health, mental functioning, the different things that you can experience and still be normal, still be part of the normal human experience, but it's not ideal. It's not how you'd want to feel, and we want to try and help people through those things so that they don't worsen. And you know, generally, if you want people to talk about problems with their minds, let's first talk about our minds. Let's talk about all the things we want, the way that we're feeling, the things that help us, and then it becomes a lot easier to say, actually, you know what, I'm starting to tip into the point where I need a bit of help here, but it's in the context of us having had the conversation already and understanding a bit about it. That would be my aim with that.
Yeah, that reminds me, I found something that I meant to share it on Twitter, that I found a little thing. I was Googling something, and one of the things I found was how to recover from creativity. I thought, wow, that's brilliant, isn't it? The idea that you would want to recover from that. So that idea of mental health.
I love the idea of a doctor diagnosing you. It's bad news. I'm afraid you're a creative person. It's just, there's no cure.
So thank you. On that note, I'm just going to give Sarah the heads up that I'm going to ask her to poor Sarah Singleton has been valiantly trying to do a graphic illustration of today's talk, which has been absolutely packed with things. So thank you so much for all of your contributions as well. Let's have a little look at that. Let's see if we can see what you've come up with.
Coming.
And while Sarah's doing that, I just wondered, I know you've been very busy in the chat, but those of you that are here, I'd love to know, as a sort of final interaction, if there's a new kind of act of self-care that you might be prepared to commit to, having sort of listened today. It could be something you felt guilty about doing before, just not got round to. It'd be great if you could share some of those. But wow, there you go. Look at that, Sarah. That's amazing. So
yeah, it was hard.
There's a lot.
You went so fast, lots and lots. Yeah.
But Sarah will share that with everyone in the blog afterwards, so that if you're a bit more visual in your thinking, that could be a really nice souvenir of the conversation. Thank you very much for that. Just a few things about what's coming up next. So our final balance talk of the year will be on the 16th of December. And we're thinking that what we might do is something that looks at preparing for 2021, setting intentions, and the power of habits. So that will be the 16th of December, and we'll send the link out to that ASAP. But in the meantime, next week, if you would like to connect back up with us, we'll be running a drop-in session next Wednesday, the 25th of November from 9:30 for an hour. Not very different to this, just much more informal, just an opportunity to kind of chat about anything that is particularly troubling you. And the other thing I wanted to say was, it's great to get your feedback in the chat, but what I really loved about World Mental Health Day, the event that we did last month, was that we got some really lovely feedback. So we were talking earlier about the need that everybody loves a bit of validation. So if you do feel at any point that you'd like to send me or Andy an email, just giving us a bit of feedback about today's session, it would be lovely to get some of those. I will pop my email in the chat so that you can do that. And finally, while I'm doing that, I'm going to attempt to do two things at once, which is always a terrible thing to do. I just wanted to offer some thank yous. Thank you again to Andy, as ever, for being so brilliant. I could see people saying, yeah, I'm really enjoying taking the idea of borrowing from the future away. That's the phrase that that's today's Andy Gibsonism that they're taking away. Thank you also to Abby for looking after the chat so well. Thank you, Abby, and Matt for doing the tech, and Sarah, obviously, for the brilliant drawing. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite everybody now to turn their cameras on and join us again for the goodbye moment. And it's interesting, I was seeing in the chat that some people were saying that they were really missing hugs. And I'd already decided this morning that I thought that the way that we might do our little goodbye moment, that hopefully Matt will capture on camera, is to just all give ourselves a bit of a hug. Now that might mean some of you need to stand up because it's very heads and shoulders. So I'm just thinking that if we could all give each other or give ourselves a hug, that could be our final moment. So on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, big hugs to everyone. Perfect. There's absolutely no way that we can do any waving. Well, maybe we can do a bit of a wave while we're hugging. But thank you so much for coming, and hopefully see you next time. Thank you so much for being so curious and generous. Thanks, everyone.